Welcome to Beyond Fear, a place where the darkest nightmares come to life. Tell me, where are you watching from? Your room? A lonely road? Or maybe the place you shouldn't be? Wherever you are, brace yourself. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It's someone's real-life horror. Put on your headphones and let's begin. I remember the excitement we felt when we first moved into that house. It was the summer of 1994, and my fiancé, our 5-month-old son, and I had finally found a place of our own. It wasn't perfect. The house was old, worn down in some places, but it was ours. A fresh start. The only thing that unsettled me was its location. The house sat right next to a sharp, dangerous curve on a quiet rural road. We had been warned about the accidents that happened there, how cars would take the turn too fast and lose control. From our front yard, I could see the skid marks on the pavement, dark scars from past crashes. But we were young, full of hope, and brushed off any concerns. At first, everything seemed normal. We unpacked, settled in, and began making the place feel like home. But from the very first night, I had this feeling, a weight in the air, like the house was holding its breath. It wasn't anything obvious, just a presence, something I couldn't quite put into words. Then came the first real sign that something was wrong. Our son refused to sleep in his room. The moment I placed him in his crib, he would scream, his tiny face twisting in terror. It wasn't just fussiness. This was something else. He would cry so hard that his little body would shake, his screams desperate, like he was pleading for me to take him away from that room. The second I picked him up, he would calm down, his sobs turning into quiet whimpers. I tried everything, rocking him, singing to him, even sitting in the room with him while he slept. But the moment I put him down, the screaming would start again. Any other place in the house, he was fine, but not in that room. Never in that room. I started noticing little things, too. The air in certain parts of the house felt heavy, thick with something unseen. The garage and the maid's quarters in the back gave me an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I avoided them as much as possible. Just walking past those doors made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then one night I heard it. It was late, past midnight, and my fiancé was already asleep. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in my chest. That's when I heard the whisper. It was faint, just a breath of sound, but unmistakable. A voice. Not loud enough to make out words, but close. Too close. I held my breath, straining to hear. The room was dark, the house silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood. Then, just as I started to convince myself I had imagined it, the whisper came again, this time, right by my ear. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst through my ribs. My fiancé stirred beside me, mumbling something in his sleep, but didn't wake up. I sat there, frozen, listening, but the whisper was gone. I didn't sleep that night. That was just the beginning. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. Sleep deprivation could do strange things to the mind, and with a 5-month-old baby, I was exhausted. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't long before my suspicions were confirmed. One afternoon, my sister-in-law came to visit. It was broad daylight, the kind of bright, sunny day that should have made me feel safe. My son was napping in the living room, and we sat on the couch, talking about nothing in particular. That's when it happened. The shadows moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe clouds passing over the sun, but the movement was deliberate. The dark shapes slid across the wall, stretching unnaturally. shifting even though nothing in the room had changed. My sister-in-law stopped mid-sentence, her face draining of color as she stared. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly, her eyes wide. We sat frozen, watching as the shadows twisted and flickered. It was as if something unseen was pacing just beyond our reality, its presence manifesting in those dark shapes on the wall. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. The room was normal again. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then my sister-in-law finally whispered, "There's something wrong with this house." I didn't argue. From that day on, things escalated. Strange noises filled the house, whispers in empty rooms, the sound of footsteps upstairs when no one was there, doors creaking open on their own. My son's refusal to sleep in his room became even more intense. If I so much as walked toward the doorway with him in my arms, he would start to whimper, his tiny fingers clutching at me as if begging me not to go inside. I started avoiding the second floor altogether. The air up there was different, thicker, colder. It felt like something was watching, waiting. Then came Christmas. We had decorated the house, trying to bring in some warmth and cheer despite the growing unease. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner of the living room, its twinkling lights casting soft glows against the walls. Every night before bed, I made sure to unplug the lights. It was a habit, something I did without thinking. So when I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the Christmas melody playing downstairs, my blood ran cold. I turned to my husband, shaking his shoulder. "Did you leave the lights on?" I whispered. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "No, you unplugged them." We both sat in silence, listening as the tiny, cheerful song continued to play. The lights were motion activated. They shouldn't have been on. He finally got up, moving cautiously toward the bedroom door. I followed close behind, gripping his arm. As we stepped onto the landing, we could see the faint glow of the Christmas lights from the living room. They were blinking, casting eerie shadows across the walls. My husband crept down the stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. When he reached the tree, he froze. The lights were still unplugged. I watched as he slowly backed away, his face pale, his breath shaky. Without a word, he turned and hurried up the stairs, grabbing my hand. "Go back to bed," he muttered. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know what he had seen. That night, neither of us slept. And the next night, we heard the crying. The next night, the crying started. At first, it was faint, so distant that I thought I was imagining it. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the unmistakable wail of a baby, filled with anguish and fear. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. My first thought was my son. Had we forgotten to bring him home? Was he in his crib, crying for me? But then I remembered, he wasn't here. He was spending the weekend with my in-laws. I turned to my husband, who was already awake, his face rigid with unease. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded. For a few seconds, we just sat there, listening. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't something carried by the wind. No, it was inside the house. Then we realized where it was coming from. The upstairs storage room. A cold dread settled in my stomach. My husband swung his legs out of bed, hesitating before standing up. "Stay here," he murmured. I shook my head. "I'm not staying alone." We crept down the hallway, every step feeling like a mistake. The crying never wavered. It remained steady, as if the unseen infant was trapped in that room, unable to escape. At the top of the stairs, we hesitated. The door to the storage room was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. The crying stopped. Silence. A suffocating, unnatural silence. My husband reached out, pushing the door open wider. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow from the hallway, but it was enough to see that it was empty. Nothing but old boxes, forgotten belongings, and dust. And yet, the air was wrong. Heavy. Stagnant. It was as if something was still there, watching us. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut. I screamed. My husband grabbed the handle, yanking at it, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the hallway plummeted, and the sensation of being surrounded, of something unseen pressing in, became unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The door flew open, sending my husband stumbling backward. The room was empty, and the house was silent again. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't sleep for many nights after that. Things started to escalate. Objects vanished, only to reappear in places they shouldn't be. Whispers drifted through the house at all hours, too low to make out, but always there. Doors locked and unlocked on their own. The air in the garage and the maid's room became unbearable. I couldn't go near them without feeling like something was standing right behind me, waiting. And the crying never truly stopped. That house wanted something, and I was beginning to fear that it wanted us. We tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination, sleep deprivation, stress, anything but the truth staring us in the face. That something was in the house with us. But denial only worked for so long. One night, as I was putting away laundry, I noticed something strange. A shirt my husband had worn earlier that day was missing. I knew I had folded it. I had placed it on top of the dresser. But it was gone. I checked the floor, the closet, the laundry basket. Nothing. I sighed, chalking it up to exhaustion, and turned to leave the room. That's when I saw it. The shirt was lying in the hallway, spread out on the wooden floor. At first, I thought my husband had moved it, but then I noticed how it was positioned, stretched out flat, the sleeves extended as if mimicking the shape of a body, like something had laid it there. A chill crept up my spine. My breath hitched in my throat. Then, from the other end of the hall, I heard it. A whisper, low, indistinct, but unmistakably real. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run. But I couldn't. My feet fell glued to the ground. The whisper came again, closer. Then the light above me flickered. Once, twice, and the air turned ice cold. I bolted down the hallway, nearly tripping over myself in my panic. I slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it, pressing my back against it as I tried to steady my breathing. I wasn't alone in this house. I never had been. The night my husband finally believed. My husband had always dismissed my fears. He told me I was tired, overthinking things. But that changed the night he saw it for himself. It was late, past midnight. I was already in bed, curled up under the blankets, trying to shut out the oppressive weight of the house. Then I heard my husband gasp. I turned to look at him. He was sitting up, staring at the bedroom door. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open in shock. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He just pointed. Slowly, I followed his gaze. The door was open. Not wide open, just a crack. But that wasn't what sent my blood running cold. Through the small gap, in the dim hallway beyond, something moved. A shadow. Not a person. Not an animal. Something shapeless. Fluid. It was standing just outside our room, watching. Then, in one smooth motion, the door creaked open another inch. I couldn't breathe. Neither of us moved. Then, slam. The door shut so violently that the walls seemed to shake. We bolted out of bed, grabbing each other in terror. My husband, the skeptic, the one who had dismissed all of this as paranoia, he was shaking. From that night on, he never questioned me again. He knew we weren't alone, and whatever was in that house, it didn't want us there. After that night, things escalated. My husband stopped trying to rationalize what was happening. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the shadows. He had felt the unnatural chill in the air. But what finally broke him, what made him accept that we were living in something truly sinister, was the sound of the baby crying. It happened on a night when our son wasn't home. My in-laws had taken him for the weekend. For the first time in months, I felt like I could sleep without that overwhelming sense of dread. But then, in the dead of night, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of a baby sobbing. At first, I panicked, thinking it was our son. But as the fog of sleep lifted, reality set in. He wasn't here. And the crying, it wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't even coming from a specific room. It was coming from the walls. I shot up in bed, clutching the blanket to my chest. My husband woke up a second later, groggy and confused. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He sat still for a moment. Then his face went white. The crying grew louder, more desperate. It sounded as though a baby was trapped inside the walls, wailing for help. My husband threw off the covers and bolted out of bed. He ran to the hallway, then to our son's empty room. I followed close behind, my heart pounding. We stood in the doorway, listening. The crying was coming from the small storage room at the end of the hall, the one we never used, the one that always felt wrong. My husband hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward and grabbing the doorknob. The moment his fingers touched it, the crying stopped. Instantly, as if whatever was making the noise knew we were listening. He yanked the door open. The room was empty, just old boxes and forgotten junk. But the air inside was heavy. It felt thick, suffocating, like stepping into a space that hadn't been disturbed for decades. Then the light flickered, and something shifted in the shadows. We ran. We ran downstairs, grabbed our shoes, and left the house. We sat in the car, parked in the driveway, staring at our darkened home, neither of us saying a word. We knew then, whatever haunted that house wasn't just some lingering energy. It was aware, it was intelligent, and it wanted us gone. The next morning, I made my decision. We're leaving, I told my husband. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. He just nodded. That same day, I started packing. But the house it knew. It didn't want us to go. Doors that had never locked before suddenly wouldn't budge. Objects vanished. Things I had just placed in boxes reappeared on shelves. The electricity flickered on and off, making it impossible to see what I was doing. But the worst part? The whispers. They weren't just unintelligible murmurs anymore. They were voices, clear, coherent, and they were saying our names. It wasn't just a haunted house. It was something darker, something that fed on us. And we had stayed too long. We left that house a week later. We didn't wait to find a new place. We packed our son's things, grabbed whatever we could fit into the car, and drove away without looking back. We never spoke to the landlord again. We never asked what happened to the house after we left. Some places aren't meant to be lived in, and some things should never be disturbed. Even now, all these years later, I still wonder, was it the land, the house, or the road that ran beside it, claiming lives year after year? I don't know, and I never want to find out. If you enjoyed this chilling story, don't forget to subscribe to Beyond Fear and hit the bell icon so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Here, you'll find more real stories filled with mystery, psychological horror, and the supernatural every week. Before you go, make sure to check out the 2 videos that just popped up in the end screen. I promise, they'll leave you with goosebumps. See you next time, if you dare.